The movie opens at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. A professor named Gerald Lambeau is teaching a mathematics class. At the end of his lecture, he tells his graduate students that he will write a very difficult math problem on the board outside the classroom. Whoever solves it will have their name recognized throughout MIT. He also motivates his students by mentioning that the people who solved similar problems in the past became leading mathematicians. Because the problem is so difficult, Professor Gerald gives them until the end of the semester to solve it. After the lecture is over, we see Will Hunting, a janitor at MIT, looking at the math problem that Professor Gerald wrote. Later, Will goes home and tries to solve the equation on his bathroom mirror. The next day, when he is alone in the hallway, he takes a piece of chalk and writes the correct answer to the problem that Professor Gerald had prepared for his students. Will enjoys spending his free time outside of work, drinking and hanging out with his friends, Chucky, Billy, and Morgan. One day, while watching a kid's baseball game, Will sees a guy who used to bully him in school. Later, he and his friends approach the guy and a fight breaks out. In the end, Will overcomes his bully and thoroughly beats him. His friends try to hold him back while the police attempt to control him. Will even attacks a police officer, which leads to his arrest. Professor Gerald learns that someone has solved the math problem. He quickly goes to check whether someone has really solved it. He asks several students if they were the one who solved the question, but he is confused when none of them admit to it. Professor Gerald asks the person to come forward and claim their recognition. The entire class looks around, waiting for someone to step up. Since no one claims to have solved the problem, Professor Gerald informs his students that he has created another math problem. This new problem took him 2 years to solve. He has set up another challenge, but he still doesn't know who the anonymous math genius is. Will gets out of jail and quickly starts solving the new problem. At the same time, Professor Gerald steps out of his office and notices Will writing on the board. Believing that Will is simply graffitiing on the board, he rushes over to confront him. The moment Will sees him coming, he runs away. Later, Professor Gerald returns to the board and realizes that Will has actually solved the problem. It took Professor Gerald 2 years to solve it, and he now knows the true identity of the mysterious math genius. After work, Will meets up with his friends, and they head to a bar for some drinks. Chucky notices a couple of beautiful girls and walks over to start flirting with them. To impress them, he lies and claims that he is in the same class as they are. At that moment, another man interrupts and asks Chucky which class he is talking about. Chucky replies that it's a history class. Since the man is actually in the same class as the girls, he immediately knows Chucky is lying. He tries to embarrass Chucky by asking him questions about historical topics. Chucky, who knows nothing about history, stays quiet. Seeing his friend in trouble, Will steps in and begins debating the man by presenting facts and sharing his own thoughts. The man responds, but Will interrupts him and finishes his entire sentence. Then he calls him out for repeating a passage directly from a book. Will laughs at the guy for spending thousands of dollars on an education that he got for free at a public library. Embarrassed by Will, the man walks away. Later, a girl named Skylar approaches Will and gives him her phone number. Skylar is impressed by Will's display of intelligence. She asks him to call her so they can go out for drinks sometime. Before leaving, Will shows her phone number to the guy who was trying to act smart earlier. At the same time, Professor Gerald has been looking for the janitor who solved his difficult math problem. After asking a few people, he finally gets Will's contact information. Professor Gerald arrives at Will's court hearing, where Will is facing charges for assaulting a police officer. Will tries to defend himself, but the judge points out that he has a long history of petty theft and assault charges. The judge says he cannot ignore everything Will has done. He sentences Will to jail and sets his bail at $50,000. Will is sent to prison, where he meets Professor Gerald, who has a proposition for him. He tells Will that he has spoken to the judge and can arrange for his release. However, Will must agree to 2 conditions. The first is that he must study mathematics with Professor Gerald. The second is that he must attend counseling sessions. Will laughs at the idea of seeing a therapist. However, to avoid spending time in jail, he has no choice but to accept both conditions. Soon, he begins taking mathematics lessons with Professor Gerald. The professor is amazed by Will's intelligence and is proud of his talent. Next, Will starts attending counseling. However, no matter how many therapists he visits, he refuses to open up and instead makes jokes about them. He reads their books the night before and mocks them during each counseling session. As a last resort, Professor Gerald seeks help from his old friend Sean McGuire, who teaches psychology at a community college. Sean initially says he doesn't have time for it. However, Professor Gerald insists that he should help Will. He believes Will is a genius and that Sean's guidance can help him reach his full potential in life. Sean finally agrees and meets Will for his first therapy session. Just like the previous therapists, Sean asks Professor Gerald and his assistant to leave the room. Will immediately starts making jokes about Sean's collection of books. Sean realizes that Will is using a defense mechanism and is intentionally trying to provoke him. Instead of reacting, Sean remains calm and talks to Will normally without asking about his personal life. Will then notices a painting that Sean painted himself. He looks at it and starts quoting art books while making several assumptions about Sean's life. Sean once again ignores Will's insults. However, when Will mentions Sean's wife, Sean becomes irritated. Realizing that Sean's wife is a sensitive subject, Will continues to push the issue. He even asks if Sean's wife had been unfaithful to him. Sean finally loses his temper and grabs Will by the throat. He warns Will to always respect his wife and never speak about her disrespectfully. Will leaves the office thinking he has once again succeeded in breaking another therapist. Professor Gerald notices Sean's mood and assumes he won't want to continue treating Will. However, to everyone's surprise, Sean asks to continue his therapy sessions with Will starting the following week. After his counseling session, Will goes on a date with Skylar. During their date, he learns that Skylar comes from a wealthy family and attends Harvard. They quickly get along and have a great time together. At the end of the date, they share their first kiss. The following week, Will returns to Sean's office. Instead of beginning the session there, Sean asks Will to come outside with him. Sean takes Will to a park and talks with him. He tells Will that he spent a lot of time thinking about what Will had said about him and his painting. Eventually, he realized that Will is just a kid who doesn't know what he's talking about. Sean explains that just as Will cannot understand someone's entire life by reading a few art books, he also cannot understand Will's life simply because he has a degree in psychology. Sean understands that Will doesn't want to talk because he's afraid of what he might reveal. However, he tells Will that, sooner or later, he will have to open up. Otherwise, he will miss out on the best things life has to offer. Will returns to his normal routine, where his friend Chucky picks him up and drives him to their construction job. Later, Will calls Skylar. However, he's afraid to talk to her. During his third therapy session with Sean, Will remains silent, and Sean does too. They remain quiet for the entire hour. The fourth session begins in a similar way, with Will not saying anything. However, out of boredom, Will decides to tell Sean a joke. Sean takes the opportunity to ask if he has a girlfriend. Will then tells him about Skylar. He explains that he hasn't been in contact with her since their first date. Sean asks why. Will replies that he feels Skylar is too good for him. He thinks that if he continues talking to her, it will just ruin everything. Sean then tells him that no one is ever too good or perfect. Everyone has flaws. What matters most is whether that person is perfect for you. To make the message clearer to Will, Sean shares a story about his wife. She was the most beautiful person he had ever seen, and he fell in love with her. Interestingly, she used to fart in her sleep. This completely changes the mood in the room. Will and Sean begin to laugh together. They are getting closer, and Will is starting to feel comfortable around Sean. Sean tells Will not to believe that Skylar is too good for him. As the session comes to a close, Sean tells him that he should simply ask himself if they will be happy together. Will is so focused on what Sean has just said that he needs a reminder that their session is over. Encouraged by Sean's words, Will goes to Skylar's dorm and asks her out again. Skylar says she wants to go out with him. However, she has a complicated problem to solve. It could take her hours or even days. Will can't wait any longer to see her, so he solves the problem on a napkin and hands it to her. Skylar and Will are ready for their second date with no worries holding them back. Skylar asks Will about his family. Will lies to her, saying that he has 12 brothers. Skylar asks Will to share the names of all his brothers. Will responds by listing 12 random names in order. Skylar doubts that Will is telling the truth. She asks him to say them all again. Being the genius he is, Will repeats the names in the correct order. At his next therapy session, Will asks Sean if he has ever regretted meeting his wife. After all, she passed away, leaving him with a lot of pain to handle. Sean answers his question by sharing the story of how he met his wife. He says he first saw her while waiting in line with his friends to get tickets for an iconic baseball game. Will feels excited because he thinks Sean saw the game live instead of watching it on TV. He asks about that moment, and Sean shares all the details of the game. However, Sean then admits that he only watched the game later on TV. He had left his friends to go on a date with a girl he had just met, who would eventually become his wife. Will cannot believe that Sean gave up a historic baseball game just to spend time with a girl. Returning to Will's question, Sean says he never regretted missing the game. He has no regrets about meeting his wife and having her in his life, even if it was only for a few years while they were together. Skylar asks Will to introduce her to his friends and family. Will is still not telling her the truth about his wife. However, he agrees to introduce her to his friends, even though he is hesitant. Skylar, Will, and his friends go to a bar. Skylar seems to enjoy spending time with them. She has a great time, tells a few jokes, and makes everyone laugh. Professor Gerald asks Sean how Will is doing. Sean says that Will has started to open up slowly. However, he will need more time before he feels fully comfortable talking about his life and why he is afraid to trust anyone. Professor Gerald shares that he has been setting up job interviews for Will at leading mathematics institutes. Once Will overcomes his mental challenges, nothing will hold him back from making a name for himself in the field of mathematics. Sean argues that they shouldn't decide Will's life for him and should instead support his own choices. However, Professor Gerald insists that he won't allow Will's talent to go to waste. Will doesn't want to take the job, so he sends his friend Chucky to the interview instead of going himself. One night, while they are talking about their lives, Skylar asks Will if he would move to California with her. When Skylar expresses her feelings, Will begins to feel anxious and says that he cannot move there with her. Skylar asks why he is afraid to commit to her and why he never tells her the truth. She reminds him that he lied about having 12 brothers. Will completely loses his temper after being called a liar. He tells her that he was an orphan and spent most of his life moving from one foster home to another. He also shares that he was abused and beaten by his foster father. Skylar begins to cry and tells Will that she wants to be with him and help him. However, Will pushes her away, saying that he doesn't need anyone's help. Will clearly has a fear of abandonment. He believes that anyone he loves will eventually leave him. Skylar cries and tells him that she truly loves him and will never leave him. However, Will lies and claims that he doesn't love her back. He walks out, leaving Skylar to cry alone in the room. Will agrees to go to a job interview after Professor Gerald persuades him. Will arrives at the interview but does not make any effort to get the job. During his therapy session with Sean, he is asked who he trusts the most in his life. Will responds that it is Chucky. Sean says he understands. Chucky would sacrifice himself for Will, but he won't be able to understand the deeper emotions that Will is struggling with. Sean asks how he plans to earn a living. Will replies that he'll work as a construction worker in Boston for the rest of his life. Sean talks to Will about his fear of stepping outside his comfort zone. He explains how this fear can prevent him from living his best life. Sean doesn't ask Will to take the job that Professor Gerald has planned for him. Instead, he asks what Will truly wants to do with his life. Will jokingly says that he wants to be a shepherd. Since Will isn't being serious, Sean asks him to leave the office. He says he doesn't want to waste his time if Will isn't going to be honest. Will becomes angry and starts shouting at Sean. Sean once again asks him what he wants to do with his life. Will remains quiet and does not respond, so Sean asks him to leave. Before Skylar leaves for California, Will calls her to say goodbye. Skylar tells Will that she loves him, hoping they can get back together. Will smiles, but he is too afraid to say it back. He worries that it will only lead to heartbreak. Will talks to Chucky and tells him that he doesn't want to get a job. He also mentions that he broke up with Skylar. When Chucky asks what he wants to do for the rest of his life, Will says he plans to live in Boston forever. He wants to be neighbors with Chucky and work with him in construction. After hearing his answer, Chucky decides to be honest with him. He tells Will that it hurts him to see his friend waste his life when there is so much more he could achieve and be happy. Chucky has just one wish every day when he comes to pick Will up at his house. He wishes that one day Will won't be there. Chucky hopes that Will leave his terrible life behind and begin doing something meaningful with it. At the same time, Professor Gerald is having a discussion with Sean. He expresses his frustration about not being able to convince Will to find a job and use his intelligence for something meaningful. Sean believes that they should not rush Will into making important life decisions when he is still uncertain about what he wants to do. He explains that Will fears being abandoned. As a result, he pushes people away before they get too close. Sean believes they should support Will in whatever he chooses to do and not pressure him into taking a job that he might end up hating. However, Professor Gerald disagrees. He tells Sean not to let Will believe that it's acceptable to ignore his intelligence and live his life as a failure. Their differing views lead to a heated argument. Professor Gerald accuses Sean of being jealous of his success and achievements. Sean tells him that he is not a failure because he never chose to be like him. At that moment, Will walks in and hears what they are talking about. Professor Gerald leaves the room to let the therapy session begin. Sean has a file containing pictures of Will's body. The pictures show bruises from the beatings he received from his foster father. Will asks if Sean has ever seen anything like that before. Sean reveals that his own father was an alcoholic who used to beat both him and his mother when he was a child. When Will hears Sean's story, he begins thinking about his own foster father. Sean stands in front of Will and tells him that what happened to him was not his fault. Will nods in agreement, but Sean insists again that it wasn't his fault. Will answers that he knows. However, Sean keeps repeating that what happened to him was never his fault. Will starts to cry and pushes Sean away. Sean tells him once again that the abuse he suffered as a child was not his fault. Will finally gives in to his emotions and hugs Sean. He cries deeply while holding Sean close. He is finally ready to let go of his past and move forward with his life. Will tells Sean that he will take one of the jobs Professor Gerald has arranged for him. With that, his final therapy session with Sean comes to an end. Will asks if he can keep in touch with him. Sean replies that he will always be there for him and encourages him to follow his heart. Will hugs Sean before saying a final goodbye. Chucky, Billy, and Morgan give Will a car as a gift for his 21st birthday. The car isn't brand new. However, Will is happy with the gift because it came from his best friends. At the same time, Professor Gerald approaches Sean and apologizes for his previous comments. Sean and his friend make up, and Sean shares that he is going on a world tour. As Sean packs his luggage, Will drives to his house and watches him prepare for his trip. Will walks to the front door, places a letter in Sean's mailbox, and quietly drives away. Chucky goes to pick up Will at his house. He knocks on the door. There is no answer. He looks through the window and notices that Will is not home. Chucky smiles when he realizes that Will has finally made a decision about his future. Sean receives the letter that Will left behind. In the letter, Will writes that he is not accepting the job. Instead, he is going to California to reunite with Skylar. Sean smiles as he reads the letter and quietly returns to his house. The movie ends with Will driving to California to reunite with Skylar. And that's how Will's journey finally comes full circle. After a lifetime of running from his past, he chooses to take a chance on his future, proving that sometimes the bravest decision isn't fighting, it's allowing yourself to be loved. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next recap.